Support for WUWM podcasts comes from University School of Milwaukee, fulfilling a values-based mission of developing learners, fostering leaders, and preparing citizens for pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. More information at usm.org/mission.
Okay, something I can freely admit is that I was not always into history. But something that brought history to life for me, besides audio, has been photography. And I get obsessed with historical photos. It's all of the details, the style, the facial expressions, all of the context. And that's something that Corky Lee was a master of.
Yeah, maybe I was somewhat invisible. But if I was invisible, I didn't want the larger community, Asian Pacific Americans, to be invisible.
This is Corky from his 2024 PBS special, Dear Corky. Corky photographed New York City and the changes in the AAPI community over generations. In 2021, he died from complications after contracting COVID.
I may be 6 feet under pushing up daisies when people realize that I've had this tremendous visual record of what took place in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s.
Anybody who's went to college and took any Asian American studies classes in the last 20, 30 years knows his work.
This is Dr. Mei Nai, history professor at Columbia University. She ran in the same circles with Corky in the 70s, and she also edited his book, Corky Lee's Asian America, 50 Years of Photographic Justice. She sent me over some of his work from 50 years ago. That's when there were huge migration shifts happening with Asians and Asian Americans.
So this was taken in the early 1970s. Corky called it Crossing Canal Street.
In this picture, people are crossing Canal Street. And maybe that's all you see. The background is a pretty quintessential, narrow Chinatown street. Banners, large and small, line the street in Chinese writing. But front and center, in this picture, there's a woman.
Middle-aged woman carrying groceries, probably on her way home from work. She probably was a seamstress in a garment factory.
Yeah, it looks like she's got maybe at least 3 bags in one arm. She's got multiple, probably work bags in the other.
So the fact that she has all those groceries also suggests that she has a family. Women and children and families were a new demographic in Chinatown.
In the photo, there are also these teen girls, very classic 70s fashion, walking casually, not really a care in the world. And there are older men, too. Their faces weigh heavy, as do the bags they're carrying. Corky was documenting a radical demographic shift in this photo, one where there were women and kids in Chinatown, because that wasn't always the case. The next photo that May wants to talk about shows a group of older men. They're all grouped together, but they're not together. All of them are by themselves.
In Chinese, we call them the Lao Hua Chao, the old overseas Chinese or the old sojourners. And they're just kind of randomly on the sidewalk in front of, is it a butcher shop? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
They're just walking
we've got
down
some
the
hanging
street,
meats.
smoking a cigarette. There's an old car there that evokes the period.
Mm-hmm.
And they are the tail end of that generation of men who came as laborers to work in the United States without their families. They had lonely years in America.
Some of these men, because of the country's exclusion and immigration laws, went 25, 30, even 50 years without ever seeing their families. And Corky's work told this story brilliantly, and it centered Asian Americans, making them visible in the U.S. immigration story in ways they never were before. But this archived history was made possible 10 years earlier. That's when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or really add importantly to either our wealth or our power.
Okay, so here are just a few things this bill did. It ended a discriminatory quota system. May says before this, Chinese immigration was restricted to just over 100 visas per year. It also set a hard cap of 20,000 people per country entering annually. And it set another hard cap against people migrating to the U.S. from the Americas. And contrary to what LBJ said in that speech, this bill would affect millions of lives right up until today. This is Status Pending. I'm Jim Gutierrez. Today, we're closing out our series looking at the history of U.S. immigration at critical points in time, and we're traveling back 50 years with this one. These changes in immigration law, at the time, were considered non-revolutionary, but that couldn't have been more wrong. We're going to find out why this bill is called the Bill of Unintended Consequences and how it has led to some of the most restrictive immigration policies of the past 100 years. This legislation was passed in 1965, so we were talking in the heart of the civil rights movement. What was the connection for this act to the movement? Like, what were people pushing for at the time when it came to immigration?
Right. 1965 is the same year as the Voting Rights Act, and it's 1 year later from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it is very much a piece of civil rights era legislation that are all aimed to correct the longstanding racial discriminations in the country's laws. And the immigration reform had been a project, a demand by mostly European immigrants, Italians, Jews, Greeks, Slavs, who all came in the early 20th century and were the prime targets of the national origin quota system, which discriminated against them terribly. Those quotas also completely excluded Asians.
They filed quietly, somewhat hesitatingly, from the belly of a chartered airliner at San Francisco Airport one recent morning. It began in 1965, when Congress abolished the policy of excluding Oriental immigration.
So this law passes in 1965, in part because there was a long history of mobilization and agitation and lobbying and support in the Congress to reform the immigration laws and to reckon with the racism that had been levied against Jews, Italians, Poles, etc., etc. And so in many ways, they envisioned it as a symbolic reform, but they didn't necessarily see that there would be, a big increase in immigration. In fact, part of their argument in Congress was that we're not going to have a lot of new people. This is mostly a symbolism to correct a racial slur that had been imposed on people of Eastern and Southern European origin.
It's so interesting that this is kind of like the push for this act, one during the Civil Rights Act. And not that these quotas didn't exist, as you were talking about, like within China, like just over 100, which is wild to think about. But as they push for this idea of inclusion, and I think what we should call this section that we're moving into now are the myths and unintended consequences of this bill. But one of those unintended consequences is that these quotas were supposed to be applied to every country evenly, right? Like 20,000 maybe to every country?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. But what we see here as an unintended consequence is we have a huge rise in immigration from Asian and Latin American countries.
The way we can think about the 65 Act is that it was based on a principle of formal equality, in the sense that we are going to treat every country the same. Every country is going to have the same number, the same quota, and that is going to be fair. And that is really just taken from the Civil Rights Act, right, where every individual is equal. But nations are not the same as individuals. And what they didn't realize was that the push for immigration from Europe was actually very low, but there was demand from Asia and Latin America.
May says these populations came in two different ways. The U.S. has always been dependent on Mexican labor, so that didn't stop. But what changed now is that the people coming over were criminalized, considered undocumented or illegal. For East Asians and later South Asians, the U.S. used something called occupational preference to fill their quotas, high-skilled workers in fields of demand. At the time in the U.S., that meant telecommunications, healthcare, and hospitals.
Right, the Philippine quota of 20,000 was used up almost exclusively by nurses who came to work in the growing hospital systems in the United States in the late 1960s and 70s. Others were engineers, scientists, chemists who worked in pharmaceutical companies. And then once they were here, they could become a citizen. And then they began to petition for their family members to come over under their family preferences. So you have this kind of exponential increase based on entirely legal and legitimate means.
May says this is also a huge reason for the model minority myth. It's less about the people, but by the patterns produced directly by immigration laws favoring professionals. And those professionals brought over family and friends from the same social class. You touched on this, but another unintended consequence was that you had this hard cap on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, which fueled this undocumented immigration kind of like push or this creation of illegality, and also manufactured it because this was, ever since the creation of that border, the southern border, a country that had been dependent on Mexican labor. Can you tell me about the unintended consequence of this hard cap on the Western Hemisphere?
That's a really good question because before 1965, it's hard for us to believe that there was no numerical quota on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. There were other kinds of restrictions, like you had to have a visa and you had to pass through border inspection, but there was no numerical cap. So in 1965, they made a formal restriction and included the Western Hemisphere. And it's really in 1965 that you have established a global restrictive system. And so in some ways, it was more restrictive, numerically speaking, than the previous laws had been. So today, for example, or actually since the 1980s, if you want to apply to come from, say, a country with a low sending volume, say you're from New Zealand, it's really, there aren't that many people applying to get in, so there's no wait. On the other hand, high sending countries, Mexico, India, China, and the Philippines, a wait to come legally under any of the preference system could be 10, 15, 20 years, depending on the category you're talking about. So that's why you have this increase of undocumented migration, because who's going to wait 20 years?
Longer. So right now, there's nearly 12 million applications awaiting a decision, and that's for citizenship, work permits, or other permissions to live and work in the United States. And that includes about 200.
Within the series, we looked at these big moments within U.S. history as we celebrate the 250th birthday, what immigration looked like 250 years ago, where we were 100 years ago with that Immigration Act of 24. And then we're here in 2026, and we're seeing a ton of exclusion from a lot of countries, maybe you'd call them the global south. I mean, it's a big question I'm kind of throwing at you, but what is the immigration history over the past 50 years when we look back?
1965 immigration reform was a famous law of unintended consequences. This opened up America to people from many other parts of the world who had not previously come. And so by the late 20th century, we have a really different America, one that's really multiracial, multicultural. Immigrants contributed vastly to the economy. So immigrants have really become a part of American society. And what we've seen under the Trump administration is a gigantic backlash. He rode to power on the slogan, "Build the Wall," and he has been nothing but a steady drumbeat of nativist rhetoric and restrictive and exclusionary laws. The only refugees who can come to America now are white South Africans. For all intents and purposes, they have ended the right to asylum. So this is a terrible time for immigrants and for all Americans who care about the rule of law and fairness and justice and diversity in our country. You're in Wisconsin, which is next to Minnesota, right? That's where we had an amazing, first a terrifying reign of terror that was imposed on the people of St. Paul and Minneapolis and throughout the state by ICE. But you saw this amazing response by ordinary people to protect the immigrants, regardless of where they came from. And it was an act of neighborly love.
This system violated the basic principle of American democracy, the principle that values and rewards each man on the basis of his merit as a man. It has been un-American in the highest sense because it has been untrue to the faith that brought thousands to these shores, even before we were a country. Today, with my signature, this system is abolished.
That was Columbia history professor Dr. May Nye. Today's episode was produced by me, Jimmy Gutierrez, and edited by Emily Files. Status Pending is a production of WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, part of the NPR network. This wraps up our series looking at some of the big moments in the history of U.S. immigration. Thank you so much for listening. Subscribe to Status Pending for more stories about immigration in Wisconsin and beyond.